we now have tools that we can push content out through employee networks, and we can measure effectiveness. What are the biggest challenges for companies that are trying to engage employees?
I think, whenever that question is about measuring effectiveness, I think everybody is in some way chasing that same holy grail of being able to attribute everything back to its source. So certainly brands are trying to do that, understanding all of the impacts along the customer journey and what leads to that positive outcome, purchase or loyalty or whatever other metric is critical. And that's hard to do. It's theoretically easier to do with employees who are sort of a captive audience, but you're still faced with that same question. Is that employee loyalty and advocacy, is that coming from the CEO? Is that coming because you have a really strong internal communications program where you're engaging transparently? Is that because the culture has a really strong bond with managers or across teams? So it's that same challenge of, I have an end state that I have to attribute back to multiple inputs. And so I think it's going to be challenging as people get more sophisticated to try to isolate those different impacts toward that goal. So I don't know of many people who are doing things much more sophisticated than sort of good, smart, continued polling of their employees and understanding their satisfaction and their sort of stated drivers of that. I know some of the tech companies are using tech to try to observe behaviors that are correlated with high employee satisfaction, engagement, loyalty, and things like that. So it's probably going to be an answer, but I don't think it's going to be any easier to solve than that question of attribution is on the brand side as well.
Particularly among millennials, particularly among the developing world, but it is a global trend. This is an expectation that consumers have. And actually 51% of the people we survey globally believe that brands are more likely to be able to have a positive social impact than government. So that's the expectation set globally. And in China and India, that's into the high 70s, even 80s. So there's a huge desire for action and advocacy around issues that consumers care about. So I don't think it's optional. I mean, I think the first, second, and third requirements are just transparency. You've got to get really crafty about expertise and other types of engagement, and then think really carefully about the channels to disseminate that.
At the core of it, at the base of it, you've got to go back to your company culture, your organizational culture, and build a long-term strategy there.
Yeah, and there's no one-size-fits-all. There's some best practices, but company culture has a huge impact on that. And so if you're a company that historically has had, kind of a lousy corporate culture, you're going to have to work really, really hard and use lots and lots of tools. For companies that enjoy already quite strong metrics around employee satisfaction and engagement, you're chasing sort of the elusive 80th or 90th percentile. Those are going to be very different tools, but I think it's all going to relate to culture, and those have to feel sort of on brand of the internal brand to your employees. A Cisco couldn't try to do something that's right for Starbucks and expect sort of the same result. I mean, I think being very analytical about outcomes and really gathering all the data you can is critical, and that's certainly going in the long run to serve you better than starting with the best practices. But even if you've got a program to analyze, you've got to start somewhere. So why would you not start with some best practices?
Well, and maybe seeing best practices as a general framework, but just not, here's this thing that worked 4 years ago for company X, it's going to work for us.
There's a huge space for, I think we're going to see a lot of really exciting creativity around employee engagement and internal conversations, and some of the same firepower being tuned on that currently, sort of goes into advertising and comms externally. So a best practice is still just an empty vessel. You've got to have good ideas and creativity fill that, and that is, again, going to be heavily dependent on company culture and hopefully very analytical in nature.
With the trust in the institutions in general.
If we get into sort of the epistemology of the question, we'll never be able to figure anything out. So trust is truly as far as we can tell in the eye of the beholder. How much do you trust each institution to do what is right? Almost always when we see really massive swings up or down in the country in trust in government or business, there's almost always a precipitating event, an electoral change, a major corporate scandal. So we know that those signal events do loom large for respondents. We don't disclose any of the brand level data that we have, except to the clients who own those brands. But we do look at trust in business by sector. And then we do have a handful of, or not a handful, we have a number of companies in that sector, so we can look at those dynamics. And I will say two kind of conflicting things. One, yes, there are companies that stand well apart from their peer set in that sector. But the most predictive data point in the trust in any given company is the sector in which it resides. There are still a ton of brands and influencers that are flouting the FTC regulations on this, frankly, because they can afford to pay the fines and don't think there's any reputational penalties. So, you know, we need to do better as a community to sort of naming and shaming the people who are doing that. I think the good news is that beyond that transparency, consumers, and again, particularly millennials, and I would expect Gen Z, come with this tremendous built-in filter for authenticity. If a brand is engaging on something inauthentically, they've sort of been trained to decode that kind of natively. And so I think that's going to help us do this right. If you really commit to be authentic and you really understand your consumer, so you understand what their expectations are around authenticity, you know, short of falsifying data or having a product that doesn't behave in the way that it says, which is like, that's not an advocacy problem, that's a deeper in the supply chain problem. But I just think transparency and authenticity and really, really, really knowing not just your consumer, but all of your stakeholders and their expectations. If you're guided by those three things, it's going to be hard to be really off base, I would say.
Is the trust barometer finding kind of the overarching context that we then operate within?
Yeah, I think we really now see it as the meta construct of the other work that we're going to do. It informs the research that we do, so that we know where we're starting from, not, you know, sort of doing the research from the status quo ante of 3 or 5 years ago, but like we understand the environment, so the research and insights work can start at a more advanced place. And then that research is going to inform the work that we do. And then, you know, the work that we do and seeing what's effective in this environment, we sort of feed back into our understanding of how the world works. And so there have definitely been programs that we've done over the past year that are informing the questions we're going to ask next year.
If you don't read, you can't write. If you can't write, you can't think. And if you can't think as communicators in this incredibly complex, multi-stakeholder world where you know, communicators really have an impact on how things are going to go, then we're all in bad trouble. So, you know, have that curiosity, be engaged in all forms of content. I guess I should say read and watch videos, because apparently that's not going away. But, you know, whatever the end communications method is, just because the campaign might be about emojis, somewhere in there you're going to have to think strategically about what that's supposed to do. And I've yet to meet the person who can think strategically, who can't write a decent declarative sentence. So I just think, you know, I'm a liberal arts guy, I'm kind of old school, but I just believe that in my bones.